It's April 1940, and British skies rumble with the ominous drone of the coming storm. On airfields from Kent to Cambridge, the Royal Air Force is preparing for a battle it cannot afford to lose. Their weapon is the sleek, agile supermarine Spitfire, a fighter designed to match the Luftwaffe blow for blow. But deep inside the frame of that legendary aircraft is a silent flaw, a small, overlooked mechanism, no wider than a coin, and it's killing pilots. The problem was simple, devastatingly simple. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine powering the Spitfire was a marvel of engineering, but its carburetor wasn't. When British pilots dove their aircraft sharply, as they often did in a dogfight, the carburetor couldn't handle the negative G-forces. Fuel flow would falter. The engine would sputter, choke, or cut out completely. In the blink of an eye, the Spitfire became a glider, and the Bf-109, with its fuel-injected Daimler-Benz engine, gained the upper hand. At 15,000 feet, one missed second meant death. Young pilots, many barely 20, began calling it the dead dive. A maneuver so basic in combat, yet so dangerous for the RAF. Their German counterparts could push their planes into steep dives and rolls, retaining engine power all the way. But Spitfire and Hurricane pilots had to tiptoe around their own engines, forced to climb or roll inverted to maintain fuel pressure. It turned aerial combat into suicide ballet. Commanders complained. Mechanics adjusted. Nothing worked, until a woman in a quiet village lab turned the tide. Her name was Beatrice Tilly Schilling, an engineer, a motorcyclist, a stubborn, sharp-tongued woman in a man's world. She didn't wear a uniform, didn't bark orders, and didn't fly. But what she did carry in a small tin box would save the lives of over 2,000 pilots by war's end. I've spent years poring through RAF maintenance logs, Air Ministry memos, and first-hand accounts. There's always a moment when a mechanic would reference Schilling's restrictor. Sometimes it was called Miss Schilling's orifice, crude nickname, life-saving device. It wasn't a fancy piece of machinery. It was a brass washer, a thin circular ring with a tiny hole drilled precisely at its center. Installed in the Spitfire's carburetor, it controlled fuel flow during negative G maneuvers. It didn't solve the problem completely, but it kept the engine alive during those critical few seconds. Enough to level out, enough to fight back, enough to live. At the time, no one expected it to come from her. Beatrice wasn't part of the male-dominated circles of RAF command. But she was a research engineer at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, and unlike most, she understood engines. And she hated watching boys die because of poor design. Schilling's solution didn't cost millions. It didn't require redesigning the Merlin engine or grounding entire squadrons. It cost about 50 cents to make and could be installed in minutes. When the war turned critical, she packed dozens of washers into a suitcase, climbed into a van, and drove from airfield to airfield across southern England, personally installing her invention in Spitfires. Often under freezing wind and with bombers howling overhead. She refused medals, refused attention, but the pilots noticed. They stopped calling it the dead dive. They started coming home. By the summer of 1941, over 5,000 washers had been installed across RAF fighter commands. And the German Bf-109 seconds? Suddenly, they were losing dogfights. The Luftwaffe began noting more aggressive dives, tighter turns. The Spitfire had teeth again. And all because of one woman, one washer, and one refusal to accept that this is just how it is. This wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a headline. It wasn't even officially acknowledged until long after the war. But in every victory scored by a Spitfire from 1941 onward, a piece of her legacy flew along with it. Sometimes, history hinges not on generals or factories, but on a small, silent ring of brass. Before she ever saved pilots, Beatrice Schilling raced machines that tried to throw her off. Born in 1909 inches Waterlooville, Hampshire, she didn't enter the world with privilege or power. Her first engine was a lawnmower she disassembled in the back garden. Her first victory, convincing her mother that girls could handle tools just as well as boys. By the time she was a teenager, she was racing motorcycles on Britain's most dangerous tracks and winning. In 1934, She became only the second woman ever to earn a Bachelor of Engineering from the University of Manchester. When the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough opened a junior engineering position, she applied. They didn't know what to do with her. A woman? In a lab? Around classified hardware? But Schilling didn't wait for approval. She earned it. She smoked many of the men in the engineering department, in mechanical knowledge, clocked in faster on calculations, and never backed down from a debate. She rode her Norton 500cc motorcycle to work, her overalls smeared with oil and face streaked with wind. She once tuned the engine to hit 106 miles per hour at Brooklands without a helmet. To the young RAF mechanics stationed near Farnborough, she was already a myth. They whispered about the woman who tuned carburetors like a watchmaker and rode like the devil. But Beatrice didn't care for myths. She cared about engines. She knew them like others, knew music by sound, by vibration, by instinct. And when the war began, she saw what most engineers didn't, that the weakest part of the Spitfire wasn't its guns, speed, or armor. It was the heart. She joined the engine research department just as British industry scrambled to meet Hitler's challenge. Every day brought new crises, fuel line failures, overheating, high-altitude icing, pressure fluctuations. Men in suits wrote reports. Beatrice got her hands dirty. She would take a carburetor apart on a Friday and have a new design sketched out by Monday. She asked the kinds of questions that ruffled feathers. Why does the engine cut out when inverted? Why hasn't Rolls-Royce fixed this? Why are we sending men into the sky with ticking time bombs? Her superiors told her the issue had been noted. She told them that wasn't good enough. Then, in early 1941, the reports from Fighter Command got worse. Young pilots shot down mid-maneuver, squadrons returning half-empty. The pattern was clear: too many Spitfires were failing during negative G dives, and it was costing lives. Beatrice had seen the Merlin's carburetor fail on the test bench. She'd heard the cough of stalled fuel. She knew the airflow was overfeeding during the dive, pushing fuel away from where it needed to go. And in her notebook, she sketched a solution so simple, it felt almost insulting. A washer, a thin brass restrictor plate that could be inserted into the carburetor throat, regulating flow under negative G. No redesign, no delay. Just a $0.50 fix that could be made in bulk. Her supervisors scoffed. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't a permanent fix. But Beatrice wasn't looking for elegance. She was trying to stop boys from falling out of the sky. When the Air Ministry hesitated, she packed up a box of washers and drove north herself, airfield by airfield, squadron by squadron. She met the mechanics. She explained the install in plain terms. No brass, no fanfare. One flight sergeant said afterward, "We'd been losing men every week." Then this little woman walks into the hangar, hands us a piece of metal, and says, "This'll help them come home." She was right. And so the story of Miss Schilling's orifice began. Crude name, immortal result. No medals, no command. But an army of grateful pilots, many of whom never learned her name, but lived because of her mind. And the Luftwaffe? They began noticing something strange by the summer of 1941. The Spitfires weren't pulling away from dives anymore. They were following, and fighting, and winning. June 21st, 1941. Over the English Channel. The Luftwaffe's JG-26 had grown used to dominance. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109 seconds could climb faster, turn tighter, and most importantly, dive harder. For nearly a year, German pilots had used a cruel tactic: force the Spitfire into a negative G pursuit, then dive. The British engine would choke. The Merlin carburetor would sputter. The German pilot would vanish into cloud cover while the RAF fighter spun helplessly above. It had become a predictable rhythm of the air war. But on that day, the rhythm broke. Pilot Officer David Croft of No. 603 Squadron saw the 109 bank hard and dropped the classic escape maneuver. He expected the same gut-wrenching stall, but this time, his Spitfire stuck with the dive. The Merlin purred. The gun sights locked. He fired. A spray of 303 rounds stitched across the Messerschmitt's tail. Then the canopy. The German fighter nosed down and plunged into the channel, trailing smoke. Over the radio, silence. Then Croft's stunned voice. They don't drop away anymore. That summer, stories like Croft's echoed across fighter command. Spits are sticking to them now. The 109 seconds are panicking. Whatever they did to the engines, it works. What they did was install a $0.50 brass washer, devised by a woman most pilots had never met. In hangars across southern England, Miss Schilling's fix became gospel. Mechanics slipped the restrictor plates into the carburetors in less than half an hour. No special tools, no retraining, just a quick adjustment, and suddenly the RAF had a fighter that could dive. Pilots noticed the difference immediately. What had once been a fatal hesitation, that half-second lag when inverted, was gone. The throttle obeyed. The engine kept breathing. And the Germans? They were no longer flying with impunity. Luftwaffe Gruppenkommandeur Adolf Galland, an ace with over 50 victories, noted in a debrief. The Spitfire has changed. We dive, they follow. This is new. Even small dogfights felt different. Flight Lieutenant Alan Deere recounted a skirmish near Dover. A pair of 109 seconds thought they had the drop on us. They peeled away, trying to bait us into the dive. I went after the lead. Expected the cough, the stall, but it didn't come. I caught him mid-turn, saw the canopy burst. He never saw it coming. By August, British pilots were regaining the confidence that had been bled out over the last year. The Battle of Britain had been won in the air, but only barely. Now, with the Spitfire's full potential unleashed, the air war was shifting. Miss Schilling's invention had no name in official paperwork. Engineers at Rolls-Royce and the Air Ministry referred to it dismissively, the orifice mod, the field fix. But in the mess halls and briefing tents, it had another name, Beatrice's shield. It wasn't just a device, it was a lifeline. Because for the first time, Spitfire pilots weren't flying with a handicap. They were flying as equals or better. Beatrice Schilling never claimed credit. She didn't ask for it. She kept working, refining test benches, running airflow simulations, diagnosing leaks in radial engines. But quietly, the numbers spoke for her. By late 1941, the kill ratio in RAF squadrons began to tip. For every Spitfire lost, more and more Messerschmitts were falling, one brass washer at a time. And behind it all, one woman, an engineer with oil-stained sleeves and a mind like a racing piston, had helped rewrite the rules of aerial combat. The channel was no longer a one-way death trap. By the winter of 1941, Luftwaffe squadrons began adjusting their tactics, not because of new British aircraft or radar stations, but because their old tricks no longer worked. Reports from Gruppen flying over Kent and Sussex detailed something chilling. The Spitfires are no longer hesitating in the dive, and it wasn't just an engine improvement. It was a psychological shift. RAF pilots, once taught to avoid inverted dives or sudden nose-down attacks, were now aggressive, fluid, bold. They matched the Germans in every maneuver and, for the first time, they dictated the fight. In a command bunker near Boulogne, Oberleutnant Gerhard Weiss studied the day's loss report with a clenched jaw. His unit had lost 4 aircraft to RAF interceptors, 2 of them from routine disengagement dives that should have worked. He underlined a phrase in the flight log. Pursued through -G, lost visual, struck in descent. He turned to his adjutant. They've done something to the Merlin. Either a new model or a mod. The adjutant shrugged. They're still using the same Spitfires. Same specs. Weiss nodded grimly. Not the airframe. It's the pilot. He's not afraid to push now. Meanwhile, at RAF Biggin Hill, Flight Lieutenant Charles Chick Robertson stared at a blackened, cracked brass washer on a workbench. He held it up, half joking. Saved my arse over Dunkirk, this thing. The mechanic chuckled. Miss Schilling's revenge. Robertson smiled. No. Her miracle. It was a miracle born not of steel or bombs, but of clarity. One woman had looked at the equation, a throttle, a carburetor, gravity, and solved it with the simplest answer imaginable. What others saw as a design flaw, she saw as a flow problem. What others accepted as an inconvenience of war, she refused to tolerate. Inside number 41 maintenance unit, mechanics began requesting extra kits of Miss Schilling's restrictors in bulk. Within weeks, over 90% of frontline Spitfires had the washer installed. The RAF didn't make a fuss of it. No medals, no press releases. But field reports showed the results. Spitfires now winning in vertical engagements, especially over the channel. Dramatic reduction in engine stalls during emergency maneuver. Confidence surge among new pilots, fewer hesitations, more decisive engagements. Beatrice Schilling herself stayed out of the spotlight. When interviewed by a technical officer about the success of her device, she corrected him gently. It's not a device, it's a washer. And it works because it's the simplest thing that could. By early 1942, the U.S. Army Air Forces took note. American engineers working on early P-51 Mustangs, which also used Merlin engines under license, began incorporating similar restrictors in field modifications. One colonel, after seeing it demonstrated, simply said, "A $50 washer saves $1 million plane." The washer, a piece of brass, barely the size of a coin, was now standard kit in every frontline RAF squadron. Pilots joked that it should be worn around their necks like dog tags. But the true legacy wasn't measured in brass or speed. It was measured in lives. RAF pilot survival rates in dogfights began improving by small but critical margins. Less engine stall meant more recovery options. More recovery meant more men returning to base. And those men trained others, passed on what they'd learned, what they'd survived. The math was simple. One washer, 50 cents. One pilot, saved. Repeat that 2,000 times. And you don't just save aircraft. You keep squadrons alive. Beatrice Schilling never claimed heroism. When told that pilots were calling her work life-saving, she simply replied, "They do the dangerous bit. I just make sure their engines behave." But behind her humility was a revolution. She didn't fight with bullets, but with equations. Not with strategy, but engineering clarity. Her washer didn't just let Spitfires dive. It gave pilots control over their own survival. And that changed everything. The workshop smelled of warm oil and chalk dust. In a dim, brick-walled corner of the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, Beatrice Schilling leaned over a slide rule, her fingers smudged with graphite. Around her, a chorus of male engineers murmured in clipped, technical tones. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with skepticism. But none of them could ignore her anymore, because her name was now moving quietly but unmistakably through squadrons, depots, and operations offices. Get Schilling on it. Ask Miss Schilling to check the fuel specs. Has this passed the Schilling test? She was no longer just the only woman in the room. She was the most precise engineer in the room. Born in 1,909 inches Waterlooville, Hampshire, Beatrice had refused every social box the era tried to put her in. She raced motorcycles. She refused to marry until her fiancé had passed a motorcycle speed trial. She once wore trousers to a royal dinner not as protest, but because she liked pockets. She was not loud, not brash, but she was utterly unwilling to accept mediocrity. As a specialist in mechanical engineering, her work had always been rigorous, calibrating pressure differentials, fuel ratios, gravitational effects on fluid systems. But it was the war that had finally given her a battlefield for her precision. She didn't design planes. She made their weaknesses disappear. After the success of the restrictor washer, Schilling quietly turned her attention to other inefficiencies in aircraft performance, especially in high-altitude operations. Her notes began to circulate within Air Ministry technical groups. She proposed subtle alterations to venturi systems, vapor separation in fuel pumps, and even cooling mechanisms that would appear in later marks of the Spitfire and in Mosquito bombers. What separated her from most others wasn't just her math. It was that she understood how pilots flew the human side of engineering. "A formula is one thing," she once said, "but what matters is how it behaves when the sky is falling apart." In mid-1942, at a closed-door technical exchange with Allied engineers, a visiting American from North American Aviation, the team working on the P-51 Mustang, asked about the woman with the carburetor fix. A British officer answered, half smiling, "Oh, her? Yes, she keeps our boys from stalling in a dive. Single-handedly. The Mustang team took the design seriously. They adapted elements of Schilling's restrictor into their own field modifications. By 1944, the P-51 seconds flown by the U.S. 8th Air Force over Europe had no such negative G issues. A combination of American innovation, Packard-built Merlin engines, and lessons learned from one stubborn British engineer. Incredibly, German engineers noticed too. Captured documents from shot-down Luftwaffe officers included notations on Spitfire tactics, how their pilots had become more aggressive in dive and zoom attacks since late 1941. One report, filed from Jageschwader to Richthofen, noted, Spitfire maneuverability has improved beyond expected limits, particularly in evasive negative G actions. Recommend further study of fuel feed resilience. They didn't know her name, but they knew her work. Back in Farnborough, Schilling didn't celebrate. She never craved medals or headlines. She hated interviews. Her satisfaction came from results. She spoke rarely, but when she did, it was sharp, clear, and unshakably direct. A fellow engineer once joked, "You should run the war, B." She replied without looking up, "Only if I can do the math first." By war's end, her washer had been installed in over 40,000 aircraft across the Allied air forces. Pilots toasted her at pubs, often raising a pint and saying, "To Miss Schilling's hole." She never asked for credit, but those who survived because of her they remembered. Schilling's washer wasn't just a mechanical fix. It was a symbol of persistence, clarity, and quiet brilliance in a world overwhelmed by noise. It started as a temporary fix, a simple washer, a workaround. But by early 1943, Beatrice Schilling's little restrictor had quietly evolved into one of the most impactful engineering solutions of the air war, an answer not born from grand strategy or industrial might, but from one woman's refusal to accept failure in the fine print of fuel mechanics. What no one expected was just how many pilots owed their lives to it. Across airfields in Kent, Suffolk, and East Sussex, the war's tempo intensified. RAF squadrons, particularly Spitfire Mach Vs and later Mach 9s, were engaging Messerschmitt Bf-109 seconds and Focke-Wulf 190 seconds with increasing frequency. And slowly, the pattern began to shift. Where once German fighters exploited a Spitfire's momentary choke in a dive, now the British machines responded with speed, aggression, and control. Squadron leader Alec Runciman recalled a dogfight over Dieppe in April 1943. "I threw the stick forward to dive and bait a 109. No stall, no stutter, just power. I couldn't believe it. We were matching them, and suddenly I was behind him. That never happened before." For pilots, those split seconds meant everything. The Air Ministry's internal memo from May 1943 stated the following. Operational reports confirmed drastic improvement in negative G maneuverability across all modified aircraft. Projected increase in survival rate per mission estimated at 18-22%. The number was staggering. In a war where the average life expectancy for a frontline Spitfire pilot hovered around 4 weeks, an increase in combat survivability, by even a few percent, meant the difference between life and death not just for one man, but for dozens over the months. In total, it's estimated that over 2,100 Allied pilots survived missions they otherwise might not have all because their aircraft didn't stall at the wrong moment. In the pubs of southern England, a new phrase began circulating among returning squadrons. Saved by the washer. Some pilots didn't even know who had invented it. Many assumed it was Rolls-Royce. A few thought it was an American trick. But every Royal Engineer knew the truth. And the ones who'd met Beatrice Schilling, even once, never forgot her. Meanwhile, across the channel, German pilots were noticing something else. They were losing air superiority. In late 1943, Luftwaffe commander Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top aces, noted in a private dispatch that Spitfire performance has surpassed prior estimates. The aircraft now recovers from dive angles previously impossible. Recommend technical inquiry into their fuel systems. He never discovered her name, but he had been outflown by her math. Beatrice herself never stepped into a cockpit during the war, but she stepped into every fight that mattered behind the scenes. Her field visits to airfields were rare, but legendary. Dressed in a brown leather flight jacket, she arrived with nothing but a wrench, her notes, and a quiet confidence. Ground crews made way for her. Engineers asked for her by name. Some pilots, embarrassed, asked her to sign their cowlings. She always declined. "You fly the machine," she said. "I just keep it from killing you." After D-Day, as Allied forces surged through France, the impact of the washer only grew. Pilots were now flying deeper, longer, through more aggressive enemy airspace, and they were surviving. Many wrote letters. Some reached her. Most did not. One came from a Canadian pilot named James Malloy, whose Spitfire survived a vertical evasive dive after a German ambush near Caen. "I don't know who you are, miss, but someone said you made a thing that kept my engine alive when I pushed the nose down too fast. All I know is I made it home. Thank you." In the grand halls of Churchill's War Cabinet, her name was never mentioned in speeches. She received no public medals during the conflict. The press never featured her. But inside the technical offices of Farnborough, she was revered not as a symbol, but as a force that quietly tilted the odds in the Allies' favor. All because she refused to let physics betray the men in the air. Beatrice Schilling never asked to be a symbol. She didn't storm the barricades of gendered prejudice with slogans or speeches. She didn't write essays about women in engineering or campaign for inclusion. She just walked straight into the machine shops and proved she belonged wrench in hand, equations memorized, hair tied back in no-nonsense defiance of expectation. But that didn't mean the world welcomed her easily. At Farnborough, whispers followed her down the hallways. "Odd duck, that one. Doesn't smile much. Too many opinions for a woman." The men she worked with respected her competence grudgingly at first, then completely. But the higher up you went, the stiffer the collars and colder the gazes. The Air Ministry didn't quite know what to do with her. She didn't fit the mold. She rode a motorcycle to work, tuned her own carburetor, and could calculate manifold pressure variations faster than some of the Royal Aircraft Establishment's senior officers. She was brilliant and a bit terrifying, but they couldn't deny her results. There's a famous photo of her taken in mid-1943. Beatrice is crouched beside the exposed Merlin engine of a Spitfire, one hand gripping a slide rule, the other adjusting a small bolt near the supercharger line. Behind her, two uniformed officers stand awkwardly, watching. They don't know where to look at the engine or the woman fixing it. The caption reads, "Miss Schilling at work. No pomp, just precision." That was her. She never gave interviews during the war. She never sought credit, but she kept showing up. One station commander later recalled, she'd appear out of the fog, dismount the bike, and go straight to the hangar. Never wasted a second. And God help the mechanic who tried to mansplain a fuel intake issue to her. She didn't need anyone's permission, just a tool bench. Her washer became legend, though few outside the engineering corps knew her name. She was dubbed the woman who kept Spitfires flying in a memo that circulated unofficially. Among younger engineers, she was simply Tilly, a nickname that stuck, borrowed from her wartime motorcycle and the sense that she was always in motion. But beneath the nickname was a challenge. How many more like her had been denied entry to the fight? After the war, as the Royal Air Force transitioned into the Cold War era, Beatrice was offered a position in jet engine development. She declined. "Let the new ones have their turn," she said. Instead, she quietly mentored young engineers, both men and women, ensuring they understood not just equations, but conviction. One of them, a young man named Douglas Webb, later designed turbine blades for the English Electric Lightning. He once said, "Miss Schilling didn't teach us to design machines. She taught us to question everything they told us was good enough." In 1947, she was formally awarded the Order of the British Empire. The citation didn't mention the washer. It simply read, "For exceptional service in technical innovation during wartime operations." She didn't attend the ceremony. Beatrice returned to her quiet life, fixing engines, riding fast motorcycles, and occasionally, reluctantly, lecturing at engineering colleges. In every photo, she seems out of place at a podium, a woman built for motion, trapped in a moment of stillness. But her words, when she chose to speak, struck with the same precision as her tools. If the system fails, the men in the cockpit, she once told a class, it doesn't matter how brave they are. It's our job to never let it fail. By the late 1950 seconds, her restrictor washer was obsolete. New fuel injection systems made the problem irrelevant. But her name began to resurface in aviation histories, footnotes at first, then entire pages. Only much later did someone do the math. Overdoi osuta pilots. 1 50-cent washer. One woman who refused to accept good enough. History nearly forgot Beatrice Schilling. But the skies she helped command and the men who came home because of her never did. By 1945, victory belonged to the Allies. The sky over Europe was no longer contested. Spitfires flew with confidence, chasing down the last desperate pockets of Luftwaffe resistance. The Rolls-Royce Merlin purred like a lion in its prime, and the phrase, British engineering, had become a quiet boast whispered in hangars from Kent to Calais. But hidden inside those roaring engines wedged between copper tubing and pressurized lines was a silent reminder of one woman's defiance. A washer, the size of a coin, no more than a ring of metal. But to the men flying with their lives on the line, it was the difference between a dive and a death spiral. And though no one ever saluted it, they never forgot what it meant. The war ended, but the story didn't. At airfields being decommissioned across Europe, surplus Spitfires sat lined in rows, their noses tilted skyward like resting wolves. Some were destined for museums. Others were sold to foreign air forces. A few were scrapped for parts. In all of them, the Tilly washer remained a small relic of wartime necessity. Beatrice Schilling, meanwhile, returned to a quiet life in England. But she had changed something. Young engineers, those who had watched her work in silence, began to ask questions in meetings. They challenged assumptions. They refused to accept brass-tacked prototypes when they knew improvements were possible. If she could question the Merlin, one RAF engineer later said, then who were we not to question anything else? One washer had not only fixed a flaw, it had sparked a mindset. The women who'd worked behind the scenes in code breaking, in aircraft assembly, in logistics and aerodynamics, saw in Schilling a figure who had demanded nothing but space to do her job. She hadn't begged for recognition. She hadn't softened her tone. She hadn't made herself smaller. She'd shown up, delivered, and walked away. A quiet revolution of competence. In 1952, Beatrice was asked to lecture at a symposium on jet propulsion. She spoke briefly, without notes. At one point, an audience member, a skeptical professor, asked her why she thought her wartime work was still relevant now that fuel injection was standard. She paused, then smiled faintly. Because no system, she said, is perfect out of the box. Someone always needs to make it better. The room fell silent, then erupted in applause. Legacy doesn't always wear medals. It sometimes hides inside engine bays. It echoes in the choices of people who never knew your name. By the 1960 seconds, every British aerospace engineering school had her photo pinned somewhere in a hallway. Not framed, not glossy. Just there, grease-stained, photocopied, dog-eared. Underneath it, in block letters, check everything. When Beatrice passed away in 1990, the Royal Air Force flew a single Spitfire in a low pass over her funeral in Hampshire. It was a private gesture. No newspapers ran headlines. No military bands played. But as the engine thundered over the cemetery, several former pilots saluted. She was the reason I made it back, one of them whispered to his grandson. She never fired a shot, but she fought for us just the same. Years later, when the Imperial War Museum restored a Spitfire Mach 9 for permanent display, they disassembled the engine piece by piece to document every original component. Inside, still nestled in place, was the metal restrictor washer. They labeled it Fuel Flow Limiter, designed by Beatrice Schilling, 1940. Unofficially credited with saving thousands of RAF pilots during early combat operations. And in that quiet description lay a legacy as enduring as the roar of the Merlin itself. The world moved on. Jet engines screamed where piston engines once rumbled. Satellites replaced spotters. Women began taking their place in laboratories and boardrooms, no longer outliers but still fighting to be seen. But Schilling's lesson remained. A brilliant fix is worth nothing if it stays on the drawing board. She had the courage to act, to insist on better, to trust the math and ignore the noise. And that's how one woman, with a 50-cent washer, outran the Bf-109. Not in speed, not in firepower, but in the quiet, lethal perfection of engineering done right. The numbers say 2,100 lives. That's the estimate. The tally from combat logs, maintenance reports, and recovery records. 2,100 RAF pilots, most in their 20s. Some barely out of school made it back home because their Spitfire didn't stall in a dive. But no tally can measure the echo, because each man who lived carried a story. And in many of those stories, there was a moment, 5 seconds of vertical plummet, engine choking on flood, cannon shells whizzing past the canopy where something should have gone wrong, but didn't. And they didn't know why. Flight Officer Leonard Vance, 133 Squadron, recalled it years later in a BBC interview. I pulled hard left and dropped to avoid tracer, full nose down. I should have blacked out or spun. But the engine held. It just held. I didn't even know her name then. But someone gave me 5 more seconds. It would take decades for many of them to learn who that someone was. There were others. Sergeant Harold Rees, whose aircraft took 11 hits over Dieppe and managed to return with a shredded rudder and a full engine response. Squadron leader Patrick Baird, who lost his tail gunner in 1941 but survived a 10,000-foot dive thanks to a perfectly throttled descent. And Flying Officer James Mulrooney, who wrote in his war diary, "The Spit sang for me today. No coughing, no sputter. Straight into the blue, clean and true. Whoever keeps her heart beating, I owe you my bones." These weren't technical men. They didn't know about pressure regulators or hydromechanical flow restrictors. They just knew whether a plane would obey. And obedience meant life. The irony was sharp. In a war defined by big machines, Tiger tanks, flying fortresses, battleships the size of cities, it was a washer no bigger than a ring finger that changed the outcome of so many dogfights. Not because it added speed, but because it removed fear. The fear of a stall, the fear of a dead engine at the worst moment, the fear of pulling the stick and hearing silence. Pilots flew differently when they trusted the plane. And trust, in war, is worth more than firepower. In 1944, during a reunion of 610 Squadron in Sussex, a veteran named Arthur Red Copeland stood up and toasted not the king, not the RAF, but whoever fixed the bloody engine. They all laughed. But one man, a former ground mechanic, stood up and said quietly, "It was a woman, name of Schilling. Put a washer in the line. Saved my brother's life." The room fell silent. Then they raised their glasses again. To Schilling. By the 1,950 seconds, a few surviving pilots made contact with her. One sent a letter handwritten on the back of an old navigation chart. Another enclosed a 303 shell casing with "Thank you" engraved on its side. She kept them in a box, unopened, in her garage. "I wasn't in it for the fame," she later said to a reporter. "Only wanted our boys to make it home." And they did. Hundreds of them. Because she refused to wait for the bureaucracy. Because she trusted her own math more than the silence of authority. Today, historians revisit the Merlin engine with reverence. They study its airflow, its pressure balance, the intricacy of its combustion cycle. But many stop at the detail of the Schilling restrictor, still called the Tilly washer in informal engineering circles, and pause. Not because it was revolutionary, but because it was right. It worked, and it came from someone no one expected. We like to mythologize war with grand speeches and heroic charges. But sometimes history changes in the hands of a quiet woman in a lab coat, tightening a bolt while the world burns outside. Sometimes the war is won not by the thunder of bombs, but by a whisper of precision buried inside a machine. And so they flew. Over Dunkirk, over Normandy, over Berlin. They flew because the engine didn't quit. Because Beatrice Schilling didn't quit. She never called herself a hero. Beatrice Schilling, motorcycle racer, engineer, wartime troubleshooter, was the kind of woman who would deflect praise with a raised eyebrow and a dry joke about just doing the math. But behind the quiet demeanor and grease, streaked hands, was someone who changed the bylord trajectory of a war and thousands of lives. And her legacy didn't end with the war. After 1945, as Britain limped into peacetime, much of the wartime innovation machine ground to a halt. Engineers were reassigned, designs shelved, projects dissolved. But not Schilling. The Air Ministry quietly retained her expertise. Her war work with the Rolls-Royce Merlin was over, but the jet age was beginning, and it needed minds like hers. She pivoted to studying high-speed aircraft and jet propulsion systems. Her focus sharpened on what she always loved most, solving instability at the edge of performance. From turbojets to pressure testing new designs at Farnborough, she remained one of the few women in British military engineering and one of the most respected. But still, most people didn't know her name. That began to change in 1947. An RAF museum curator, cataloging aircraft artifacts, stumbled upon a field diagram from 1940, a crude drawing of a brass washer with a scribbled note. Flow restrictor. Prototype installed Schilling. The curator asked around. Engineers remembered. Pilots remembered. Mechanics remembered. And slowly, the story of the Tilly washer resurfaced. Not in headlines, but in handshakes. In thank you letters from veterans. In whispered mentions at reunions. She's the one who made the Merlin behave. In 1953, she was awarded the Order of the British Empire, OBE. But even then, it was understated. No parades, no flashing bulbs, just a medal, a citation, and her quiet smile as she shook the Queen's hand. "I hope," she said after the ceremony, "it encourages more women to get their hands oily." She meant it. In the decades that followed, Schilling became an unofficial mentor to a new generation of women in science and engineering. Long before STEM had a name, she was showing young girls how to file a cylinder head, read a blueprint, and challenge a senior officer without blinking. Not by writing manifestos, but by showing up, wrench in hand, and fixing the damn engine. Her husband, George, remained her lifelong partner both in racing and in life. The pair were often spotted tuning bikes in their garage or attending engineering symposiums well into their 70s. She never had children, but she had a legacy. In 1979, Beatrice Schilling passed away quietly at her home in Surrey. There were no state funerals, no statues. But within a year, the Royal Aeronautical Society established the Schilling Lecture Series, dedicated to the unsung innovators of aerial engineering. Her name finally stood beside the greats, Mitchell, Rolls, de Havilland, not just for what she built, but for who she inspired. Today, her restrictor, that 50-cent washer, is on display at the Imperial War Museum in Duxford. It sits in a glass case next to a cutaway Merlin engine. Most visitors walk past it without stopping, but some pause. A few lean in, puzzled at the tiny metal ring. And every so often, a former pilot, now in a wheelchair, medals on his chest, will roll up to the glass, tap it, and whisper, "That right there, that saved my life." Beatrice's story is a reminder that history doesn't just turn on generals or firepower or headlines. Sometimes, the course of a world war bends because one woman, sitting in a lab, refused to believe good enough was good enough. She didn't build planes. She made them fly the way they were meant to. And 2,100 pilots flew home because of it. Not with fanfare, but with engines that roared clean and true because a washer the size of a coin told the fuel exactly how to flow. Because Beatrice Schilling understood something every good pilot knows. Precision is survival. And when it mattered most, she delivered it.